Good evening, and thank you for having me with you tonight. I'm very happy to be here and to have this topic that's something that the Christadelphians pay a lot of attention to, that we actually feel that we have something to offer to you as people who may not be so aware of the Bible, a very important insight into what's going on in the world around you. Now we, first of all, as Christadelphians, are not blessed with some sort of unusual magical ability to tell the future or to know things that other people aren't. There is a wonderful little quote by the prophet Daniel, where in Daniel chapter 2, verse 38, Daniel explains, "But there is a God in heaven that reveals secrets and maketh known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days." So the point we make is that Christadelphians are not specially blessed. We merely seek to understand what the Bible has on offer because we believe that within it is the revealed answers from God about what's going on in the world around us. Now, we could spend an enormous amount of time covering the topic of where the different nations stand, their alignment and the ideologies, and we just can't do it in one night. So one of the critical chapters is this Ezekiel 38 that we've read. One person described it like this, that the whole of world affairs are being poured into a mould, and that mould is God's determined prophecy, God's determined end, and all the nations, no matter what the current state of play of nations are at the moment, they're being poured into a mould to fit a certain shape. And that shape is the events described in Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39. Wherever we see the nations at this moment, they're headed towards the events described in Ezekiel 38 and 39. That allows us to accurately tell you what's going to happen and which way the nations are going to go with confidence, despite the fact that some of the things we're going to talk about tonight, you might scratch your head and say, I don't think Russia's such a superpower as all that, or I don't think that's the way it looks at the current time. We can tell you, not because we know, but because the Bible says so. And that's the basis on which we open tonight. Now, let's dig in and have a look at Ezekiel 38. It describes a great conflict that's going to happen in the near future. It's something that's described as happening in the latter days, and without going into depth, that's something that's describing our times. And what is it that actually Ezekiel tells us is going to happen? What's the final conflict that will come about on this earth going to look like? Let's dive right in at Ezekiel 38, where we read, and verse 2. So Ezekiel is addressed as Son of Man, set thy face against Gog of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him. Now what we're going to do tonight is have a look at who these names of these nations are. Always bear in mind that these are the ancient names. These are the names that Ezekiel was familiar with, that he would have called them in his day. So first of all, we have this Gog. And Gog is the name of a person in this case. We'll see that he is of the land of, and he has a particular role. And you see at the end of verse 2, it's prophesy against him. It's an individual. Now, what does the name Gog actually mean? Well, Gog actually means the one at the top, the head, the leader. And we're going to come back and have a closer look at that in a bit more detail. There is, however, a little bit of a problem with this verse, as I'll show you in a second. There's a little bit of an accuracy problem with what the King James does here. It says that this individual, Gog, this great leader, is of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and it's well recognised that the translators made a mistake with that phrase, chief prince, in that what they did is they took a name and they translated it into its meaning, rather than actually leaving it as a name. And that name is the chief prince. When we look at other translations, what we find is that very consistently other translations rectify this problem. The Amplified Bible says, set thy face against Gog of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech and Tubal. See that? So instead of calling it the chief prince, it's the prince of Rosh, So that should have been left untranslated and left as a proper name. Young's literal, set thy face against Gog of the land of Magog, prince of Rosh. Rotherham's, set thy face against Gog of the land of Magog, prince of Rosh. I'll keep going so that we can see it's pretty consistent. Interlinear, which is another well-recognised translation of the Bible, set thy face against Gog of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh. Septuagint, set thy face against Gog of the land of Magog, Rosh, the prince of Meshech and of Thobal. So there's all these different translations which bring out that perhaps the King James made a little mistake there, and there's a group of nations that this Gog is head over. He is leader over. Let's go back perhaps to this list here from the King James. He is the prince of Rosh, Meshech and Tubal. So for us to identify who this world leader is and what he's doing, we need to start identifying what these particular groups are. Let's go for our first one, which is this Rosh character. Okay, let's just go through and start with him. Sorry, there we are. Got a bit lost there. Gesenius, who is one of the best respected study tools of the Hebrew language, the Old Testament's written in Hebrew, said this, commenting on Ezekiel 38, that Rosh is a northern nation mentioned with Tubal and Meshech, and undoubtedly the Russians. Now, this is sometimes criticised. I'll tell you why in a moment. Bocart, who's a historian, a well-known historian who commentated on this particular subject, said this: Rosh is the most ancient form under which the history makes mention of the name of Russia. It is credible that from Ross and Meshech, that is from Rossi and Moshi, of whom Ezekiel speaks, descended the Russians and the Muscovite nations of the greatest celebrity in European Scythia. Now, it's a little bit complex. I'll give you this, that the problem we have with that particular passage is that the basis for Gesenius is Bocart, and the basis for Bocart is Gesenius. There's a little bit of circular discussion going on there. But I think what we can see when we look into the depth on these and actually try and unravel who these people are, Bocart's got a little more than that. They're not actually just basing it just on, okay, the word Ross sounds like this. They're saying that the Ross was made up of a people called the Roshi and the Moshki. Now, these particular people were known to have inhabited or migrated from Europe, from European Scythia. Let's see if I can show you a little in my little diagram here. If we bring over this map here, we've got this region above the Black Sea. And if we just were to draw in where the Moshi were known to be, they were known to be in this area here, and the Rosh were known to be in this area here. So they migrated across from European Scythia, which is this region here, and came into this particular region quite some time earlier than Ezekiel's actually writing. So there were known tribes that entered this particular territory from Scythia, from European Scythia. I will talk more about European Scythia in a moment. So that's Rosh. Rosh is made up of these ancient tribes of Roshi and Moshki, which came across and migrated a long time ago. We'll get back into more detail on that in a moment. What about Magog? Now, this I find quite interesting, that what Magog actually is, just see if I can move across, is the name given to the Scythians. Josephus, who's probably one of the best known historians of the ancient era, wrote and said, Magog was founded those that from him were called the Magogites, but who are by the Greeks called the Scythians. Herodotus, another famous historian, says the name Scythia was a name given by the Greeks to an ancient and widely extended people of Europe who had spread themselves from the river Tanais, or Don, westward along the banks of the Ister, or Danube. Diodorus Siculus, another historian, says, from the shores of the Baltic to the very confines of Galata of the Greeks, Scythia above, and northern Galatia. So where are these different areas that they're actually talking about? Let's see if we can go back and have a look on our map. So if we're going to talk about which is the area occupied by the Scythians, the original nation from which Russians actually came, from the Roshi and Moshki actually came, they are between two rivers is the best information that we can actually get from the historians. Now, where is that? Let's see if I can go back to my drawing for a second. So the two rivers are the Don and the Danube. Now, this is a fairly thick tip pen, so you're not going to get a very accurate thing, so excuse me for my inaccuracy. But this here is your Danube River works its way across like so, and your Don River does a little, it goes across this way and comes back in and comes up into this area here. So there's your Don and your Danube, and the Scythians occupied this territory in between those two rivers. Now, there's some interesting detail on these particular people, the Scythians themselves. By the way, the Baltic, if you're unfamiliar, this is the Baltic region up here. The Baltic Sea is, yes, this here is the Baltic Sea up here. So when those historians say it's between those two rivers and the Baltic, they're describing almost a triangle in Central Europe, an area that's been sort of critical. Used to be Russia, was critical to Russia's survival because Russia's now living in this thin strip of habitable land through here. A lot of this region of Russia is barely habitable. And so it's critical for Russia's military survival as a nation to actually keep control over some of those old states that used to be Soviet states that broke away from them in those regions, including Ukraine, as is topical just at the moment. Okay, just a little further on Magog. I've got some interesting comments here from different historians, which I've summarised. Historians everywhere agree that the Scythians, the people of the land of Magog, were not one single people. They were a number of different clans that worked together. The whole area was flat and therefore difficult to defend, so the different tribes would coexist and operate as one body, but they would be under the domination of one ruling tribe. The ruling tribe incorporated the fighting manpower of their defeated enemies into their expanding confederation by making them subject allies. Sorry there. What that says, in summary, is this, is that Scythia, or the Magog of ancient times, was not necessarily just one nation. It was a conglomeration of lots of different tribes that inhabited that region which is in and around Ukraine, which was flat land, and they would all actually bicker and fight among themselves until one came to the top. Another historian points out and says that what actually used to happen is the terms Gog and Magog, we can see the similarity in the actual names themselves, but what used to happen is there were all these warring tribes and one would get to the top, your typical sort of tall poppies syndrome. And while that one was at the top, they were the ruling group or the ruling tribe over the Magog. Hence the term Gog, the one at the top, and the Magog, all those different tribes across that region, which were forced to work together by the ruling tribe of the time. So this makes it a little bit complex to actually assess and go, this is exactly who Magog is, because you may find, going back into history, that Magog was made up of a conglomeration of different tribes. But there was always one at the head. There was a policy which was supremacy of a ruling group or a ruling person over that particular region. So it's fascinating history to see that through that region, the history of that region has been people who strive to be the one at the top. Authoritarian dictatorships are quite sort of a powerful thing in that particular region. Just a little more on the Scythians. Herodotus tells us that in 630 BC, a numerous horde of Scythians under the king Magius, son of Prometheus, burst into Asia. Encyclopedia supports this by saying, in a war that lasted 30 years, the Scythians destroyed the Cimmerians and set themselves up as the rulers of an empire stretching from western Persia through Syria and Judea to the borders of Egypt. Now, you look at me and you say, you really dig into the history, this is starting to bore me, why do I need to know this? One of the key criticisms of the Christadelphians' interpretation and understanding of Ezekiel 38 is this, is that Ezekiel would have had no idea who these people so far away even were. How would he even know who Gog and Magog were? Why would Ezekiel talk about people that were beyond? It's like as if Ezekiel started telling you about people in Australia. They'd be outside of the realms of his knowledge. Well, the answer is actually, Britannica is telling you that in around the time of Ezekiel, these people actually came down and banged on the back door of Ezekiel's country. Zephaniah actually picks up on this in a prophecy of around 635 to 620, same time, tells us of the very same Scythian or Gogian invasion, naming the cities to be overrun and showing that the invasion all but entered into the kingdom of Judah itself. Ezekiel prophesied around 595. Now remember that's BC, so that's a little after. Only 35 years later, Ezekiel would have known just who Gog and Magog were. The Syrians were current events, not distant unknown nations. So for Ezekiel to talk about people so far away would have seemed strange, except that they were here 35 years ago, within Ezekiel's lifetime, causing havoc with a massive invasion just over the border, just over there. So yes, Ezekiel did actually know who Gog and Magog and all these different nations were. They were relevant names to the prophet at the time. They're not some sort of unknown entity. Okay, let's go on a little further. Let's look at Meshech and Tubal. Who are these people here? Well, Bowcast again. Rosh and Mosk properly denote the nations of Russia and Muscovy. They were, in all probability, the Moshi, as the people we mentioned before, a people inhabiting between the Black and the Caspian Seas during the ascendancy of the Babylonians and Persians in Western Asia. The Moshki were subdued, but crossing the Caucasus Range and spread over the northern steppes, mingled with the Scythians. There they became known as the Muscovs and gave their name to the Russian nation and its ancient capital, by which they are generally known throughout the East. Let's just go back and have a little map moment, if I can find the space for it. There it is. So where are we talking about? Well, there's our Black and Caspian Seas. Oops, sorry. Clear that off. Are these two seas here. And these tribes, even though they weren't Scythians, actually came up through this region here when the Babylonians, which is across this territory over here, which is where Babylon, I'm a little bit exaggerating, Babylon's across, well, there's the head of the Persian Gulf. So these Moshki came up into this region here and merged with the Scythian tribes that were coming across in this region, back in the time of Babylon and Persia. And they gave their name to the territory. So if you talk about Russia, you've got this lower area, and across there is Russia, but this area at the top around Moscow it's not just Moscow that's got that name in its name. There's an area of Muscovy in northern Russia. Okay, so this is where they actually came. It's probably around the 5th or 6th BC, before the 5th or 6th century BC, that this all occurred, because that's when the Russians were actually, the Babylonians were actually on the rise. What about Tubal? So we've looked at Moscow. What about Tubal? Well, Moski and Tabali migrated from the northern Caucasus as tribes in the 6th and 7th century. This is a little later. We're out of the BCs and into the ADs now. Tracing their course downwards, led by the two mighty streams, the Volga and the Don, the Moscow region would have been the goal, which we believe was not settled until the 8th or 9th century. Tobolsk was settled and established in the same time by Slavs migrating to Siberia. Ezekiel refers to the people of Rosh, Meshech and Tubal, which are Rosh, Muscovy and Siberian Tobolsk. So what are these particular regions that we're talking about now? Excuse me here, I'll just find my space. So what are we talking about when we talk about these particular regions? Well, you've got your Don River. I'll go back to my drawing for a second. You've got your Don River coming through here. You've got your Volga River coming from the top of the Caspian up and around. But then you've got, up from the top here, you've got your Ob River, and this area up here is known as Tobolsk. So these particular people in the 6th and 7th century came up into this region and then went across into here and established the capital of this particular region, which is Tobolsky, up in this region here. So we've got, when we talk about Rosh, Meshech and Tubal, we're talking about Meshech in the area of Moscow. We're talking about Rosh is perhaps a little lower down here, and we've got Tobolsky across here. And it's some of the key regions that make up Russia and are identified by some of these historians. Let's move on. And they are united with a different group of people. We're digging into this in detail because this tells us about the different people of the region. Let's go back to our Bibles and look at this. So we've got this group of people headed by a man called Gog, of the land of Magog, that's that warring area which is in and around Ukraine, the chief of Meshech, Tubal, and of Rosh, Meshech and Tubal, which is Russia, Muscovy and Tobolsky. Now, please understand, these are broad brush explanations. You'll find finer detail if we are to dig into it in more time. And I will turn thee back and put hooks into thy jaws and will bring thee forth. Now, the expression to put hooks into someone's jaws was a military expression where what they would do is if they'd taken a slave, they had a horrible tradition of putting hooks into their mouths and dragging them out. Somewhat like when they put a ring in a bull's nose, you can actually force that animal to do what you want, regardless of its size and power. So what that's saying is that this confederacy will not have an option. This will be something they have to do. And they'll come out, all of them with thine army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed with all sorts of army, a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. Now, several points to note here. The word for company here is kahal in the Hebrew. Excuse my pronunciation if that's not quite correct. But in the New Testament, the Septuagint, which is a Greekified version of the Septuagint identifies this word as ecclesia, which is translated in the New Testament as the church. So this is not, this word here for a great company is not just a word for a number of people. It's a word for a religious assembly. So what we're being told here is that not only is this a military confederacy, but that word, and it comes up again in verse 7 and also over in verse 15, is that it's a religious association as well. There's strong religious ties that bind these people together. And all of them come down with bucklers and shields, and all of them carrying swords. Now, what we're going to see in this description here is a range of different nations described. First, you've got Rosh, Meshech and Tubal and Magog, and they come down with offensive weapons and cavalry. So they're the attack force, if you like. I'll just skip ahead a little bit. Verse 5 describes another group. Verse 5, Persia, Ethiopia and Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet. What? No horses? No swords? Doesn't mention them. So basically the next group have a different role to play. So the role that these group are going to be in is a defensive, shall we say. That's the equipment, based on the equipment that they have of shield and helmet. But then the third group, Gomer and all his bands, the house of Togarmah of the north quarters and all of his people, and many people with him. Now, the description there is not of having any equipment, so to speak, but just simply huge hordes of people. So this is the different groups that we've got coming down. Let's go into this next group here for a moment. What are Persia, Ethiopia and Libya? Let's have a look. Well, Unger's simply says that Persia extends from the Indus in the east to the Tigris in the west. Now, Persia's not quite so hard to explain because Persia used to be the name given to Iran. It's not too far back from our lifetimes, or perhaps even in some people's lifetime, that they had a revolution and renamed the country to Iran. Before that, it was called Persia. Afghanistan and Pakistan are potentially already also included because they were the territories of ancient Persia. So if we're to look across here, let's go back to our map again. We've got, for those of you who are not familiar, and I'm never quite so good at this, so let's just have a quick review. Iran is at the head of the Persian Gulf. I think we're going to have to move the map over a little bit. So there's our Persian Gulf down here, and Iran is going to be at the top of the Persian Gulf in here, approximately. Please pardon me if you're Iranian and know better. And then you've got Afghanistan. Well, let's just go across like this. Afghanistan and Pakistan across here. And I guess if we're going to go much further, we're going to get across into India over here, which is not included. So I'll scrub that out. The allies are Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. Okay, that's the extent of ancient Persia. What about Ethiopia? Now, there is a country today called Ethiopia. Is it simply describing that? Well, Unger's Bible Dictionary says that the ancient name Ethiopia was a little broader than that. It was south of Egypt, corresponding with what is now called Sudan. The Hebrews describe it as Cush, that lay to the south of Egypt. So this is this region. Let's go back to our little drawing, and I think I've still got my letters on there. No, they've dissipated. This is this area over here is Sudan, or Ethiopia is down just south of Egypt. So we've now got a confederacy of allies, which includes Sudan, Iran, Afghanistan, and perhaps across as far as Pakistan. It depends on the extent of Persia that we're talking about. So you can see these different regions across here, and you may be already spotting there's some sort of similarity between those regions and their political alignment, that they are going to be aligned with the Russians and those Europeans at that stage. And last one, Libya, the tract of land on the Mediterranean between Egypt and Carthage, according to Unger's Bible Dictionary. And that's not too hard because it's still called Libya today, and it's over here. So we've got Libya in this, I can't do it, in this region over here. So we've still got Libya across in this region here. Okay? So there's our different nations that are the second wave, the second group, if you like, the more defensive group. What about the last group? Gomer and all who bands, the house of Togarmah of the north quarters, and all his bands and many people with him. Okay, well, the explanation of Gomer is this, that Gomer, Isidore, writer of encyclopedia, one of the very early encyclopedias ever written, Gomer was preceded the Galatai, that is the Gauls. Anyone who's read the esteemed historian Uderzo and Gascony will know that the Gauls are the French. Encyclopedia Britannica says Continental Celtics is the generic name for the language spoken by the people known in the classical writers as the Celtio or the Galatai. Only in Gomer or in northern Italy are these inscriptions found. So this Gomer had a particular language that was found in areas of Italy, but also in France. Encyclopedia Britannica says that French Galli, or Latin Galli, is the region inhabited by the ancient Gomer, comprising modern-day France, parts of Belgium, western Germany, and northern Italy. I think that also shows you another point of what's going on here is, even though I'm trying to nail down some of these nations to a modern-day name for the sake of our understanding, we're actually talking about ancient names, and some of those ancient territories like Persia wasn't just the modern-day Iran or Persia, it covered areas across over into Afghanistan and so forth. And same with this, when we talk about the Gomer of Bible prophecy, it's not as simple as just saying it's France, though that was the core, perhaps one of the core territories of this particular region. What about Togarmah? Well, Togarmah, Smith's Bible Dictionary identifies for us and says Togarmah is actually Armenia and Turkey. It's a region bordering on Armenia and Turkey. Togarmah is probably the ancient name of Armenia. At its height, Armenia extended from the south-central Black Sea coast to the Caspian Sea, and from the Mediterranean Sea to the Lake Uramai in present-day Iran. Okay, let's see if we can find ourselves a bit of map space to have a look at that. So that's this region through here that is between these two seas. This is Armenia in here, between those two seas there. And it extended from that region at its peak across in both directions and could have encompassed some of Turkey. So this is the different territories that are being mentioned in Ezekiel 38. Now, this makes it a little tricky. We're then running on these ancient names, and we need to assess them and say, well, how does that match up with what we can see now? It's hard to do. But I think overall, if we were to step back at this point, and I know I've gone in great detail because we don't often get a chance to do it, so why not, is that when we look at the nations and the alignments of nations, what we're seeing is a group of nations that are ready to line up against Israel. That's the ideology. And these nations comprise mainly Russia and a Russian leader as the head, and some of those old Soviet state regions aligned with what we would now call some of the Arab or perhaps even ISIS regions that are around, and then a couple of European nations that come along behind and line up behind them. And you can see from this chapter that they seem to take different roles and different positions as they come into this conflict. So what do? Well, verse 7 says, "Be thou prepared, and prepare for thyself, thou and all thy company that are assembled unto thee, and be thou a guard unto them." The word for guard means a hedge, but it's a prickly hedge, and the idea was to fence something in. So the Gog is forced to constrain these nations to do what he actually has in mind. "After many nations thou shalt be visited, in the latter years thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword, and gathered out of many people against the mountains of Israel." So, there's sort of a little bit of what is this country until we get to halfway through verse 8, and it says, mountains of Israel. We know which the target of this invasion force is, which have always been waste, but it has been brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them. Now, this is describing for us some history that's only happened recently. This is the other point that perhaps helps us to nail down that this is actually talking about our day. Because for many hundreds of years, the land of Israel was waste. It was overrun by an enormous number. If you go through its history, the times that it changed hands were horrendous. And the outcome of that was the actual land itself was left like this, waste, as it says. It was very run down until the people of that land were brought back from other nations. That's only happened really at the end of the Second World War, and they dwell safely, or as another translation says, they dwell confidently. And this is definitely an attitude that we've only seen in Israel of recent dates since, say, the 1940s, 1950s. "And thou shalt ascend and come like a storm, and shall cover the land, thou and all thy bands, and many people with thee." Now I find this fascinating because I can see that this is current Russian tactics. I know I said right at the start, it's very dangerous. We don't want to be interpreting Bible prophecy based on what we can see now. But we do see that the Russians' tactic is flood the place with people. "Thus saith Adonai Yahweh, it shall come to pass that at the same time it shall come into your mind, and thou shalt think an evil thought." So there's a particular idea or ideology that comes into their mind at this particular time, and we're not left in doubt as to what it is. Its outcome is described for us in the next verse. "I will go to the land of unwalled villages. I will go to them that are at rest and that dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls and having neither bars nor gates. I'll take a spoil and turn thine hand upon the desolate places that are now inhabited, and upon the people that are gathered out of nations that have gotten cattle and goods and dwell in the midst of the land." So there's going to be an invasion against Israel at a time when Israel is fairly wealthy, and part of the aim is wealth, that there's wealth in that land of some sort that this formidable confederacy actually want to get. Now, there's a group of people that stand in the way of this invasion, and they're described as Sheba and Dedan, the merchants of Tarshish, and all the young lions thereof. And they shall say, "Art thou come to take a spoil? Hast thou gathered thy company to take a prey? and to carry away silver and gold, to take away cattle and goods and a great spoil? It seems a little rhetorical question, because we've just been told that that's exactly the reason they're coming. It seems like a little bit of a weak question. Rather than saying, I forbid you to come down and take a spoil, they're asking and saying, what are you doing here? Are you coming to take a spoil? So there's something in the response that tells us about how that interaction's going to go down. Which are these nations, and what are they described as in Scripture, in history? So let's go across and have a look at Sheba and Dedan. Sorry, I'll just have to, for a second, find my way to where I was. No. Sheba. Smith's Bible Dictionary describes Sheba as Yemen. Sheba embraced the greater part of Yemen, or the Arabian Felix. It borders on the Red Sea and was one of the most fertile districts of Arabia. It's not that great at the moment, and there's currently a war going on in Yemen. Dedan, Encyclopaedia Britannica, describes it as Oman, the southern Arabian comprising Yemen and Oman. Some sites of the northern Hijaz, such as Dedan, and places which I can't pronounce, and Tamya to the northeast of the other two, have long since been known but not yet fully explored. So there's historical artefacts and archaeology found indicating that Oman is the site of Dedan, but that hasn't been explored in depth. Okay, where are these particular regions? Let's go back to our map for a bit. They are down on the borders of the Red Sea, which is down around here, and we're talking these particular regions around the bottom of the Persian Gulf. We've got Sheba and Dedan are these two territories down here. Now, they're coupled together with a group of people called the merchants of Tarshish. And the name Tarshish has been an issue for Bible students for quite some time. It's been a challenging topic because who is Tarshish? Well, the name actually simply means that it's the Tin Isles. And Smith's Bible says, in regard to tin, the trade of Tarshish in this metal is particularly significant. Even now, the countries in Europe or on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea where tin are found is few. And in reference to ancient times, it would be difficult to name any such countries except Iberia, Spain, Lusitania, which was somewhat less in extent than Portugal and Cornwall in Great Britain. So even Smith's Bible Dictionary says it's pretty hard to name a Mediterranean country that actually could be called the Tin States, let alone the Tin Islands. So you're really limited to Portugal or Cornwall. Now, the problem is this, that Tarshish in ancient times seemed to be the name of almost a company rather than a country. That you'll find as you go through biblical history, Tarshish is described as a sea trading power, a sea trading organisation. Now, there was the traders of Tarshish who actually kept the origin of their highly prized commodity, tin, a secret. And history's revealed that Tarshish trading group was actually mining that tin from Cornwall and shipping it to the Mediterranean, where it was important because tin was one of the items they needed to produce other metals and to produce other alloys. So the understanding of Tarshish is a little complex because it wasn't so much a nation as a trading group that traded by the sea and based in Britain. Now, if we were to look at that today, we still have a match, because the match is that Britain is based in Britain, and Britain still has an enormous part to play in naval supply routes. If you were to look at the place where you can actually register a ship worldwide and organise supply routes, it's still Britain. So Britain and the company that it runs has been a naval trading company by nature for some time. So who is then the merchants of Tarshish and all the young lions? Well, it's fascinating that those two things are brought together. The Tarshish, which was the tin traders, and the nation of tin, and this idea of the young lions. The young lions, you don't have to go past Trafalgar Square to figure out who the young lions are. That the symbol of lions has always been in heraldry the British allies, the allies of England, and they are Australia, America, Canada, New Zealand, and a couple of others. So these are the ones that oppose them. Now, it talks about Sheba and Dedan, or Yemen and Oman, and I know that currently there's a conflict going on in Yemen, but that is the territory that Britain and perhaps America will occupy and place their question to the invading Gogian force of what do you think you're doing here? Now, it's interesting that that's actually currently an area where there's a large military build-up or naval build-up going on at the moment. So that could be the point at which they launch their potential threat to the Russian, the Gogian invader. So what's going to happen? We've run out of time, and it's because we're digging in perhaps just a little more depth than you usually would into some of these nations and trying to identify them. And I hope you can see, we're not just identifying them based on the sounds like principle. We don't just identify, the Christadelphians are not just looking at this and saying, well, Rosh sounds kind of like Russia and Tubal sounds kind of like Tobolsky, so that's what it is. You can actually go to sources, and I've been careful to try and stick to even some well-recognised sources like Encyclopaedia Britannica, Smith's Bible Dictionary. These are not hidden resources that are out of reach. These are some of the most common and well-respected resources that will give you these clues to help you unravel this story. It's challenging, I know, because we're talking about ancient nations and ancient territories which have long passed. But as you can see, when we start unravelling it like this, we can see the plan of what's actually about to happen. So what is about to happen? They'll come out of the north quarters. They'll come out of the territory that Gog actually occupies. It's another clue as to where he is. And many people shall come with him. And they shall come against the nation of Israel, and it will happen in the latter days. It's going to be in a date a long time away from Ezekiel's era. And at that time, Gog will come against the land of Israel, and verse 18 says that God's fury will come up in his face. God will respond. God will actually enter into this conflict and have some sort of interaction. And I will call for a sword against him. So God will bring violence against Gog. In fact, there's a list of different things that are actually brought against this army to defeat them in that day. First of all, there's the sword. He's then going to bring against them a plague. And then also it says, I'll rain upon him an overflowing rain, great hailstones, fire and brimstone. And I haven't even mentioned the earthquake there in that place. So we've got 4 different elements that God uses to go out and fight in that day. And they are going to be a sword, so there's going to be enemies that combat them. There's going to be an earthquake. There's going to be a plague, and there's going to be natural disaster. There's going to be fiery rain from heaven. I put it to you, friends, there's no army on earth that can stand against those particular things. You know, the earthquake that's described here is horrific. We're really scared about this, and we feel that this topic should be talked about so much more, because the world is about to change as never before, and we would really like to think that Australians would heed the message and get themselves on the right side of the fence before this happens. I mean, that description of that earthquake that seems to be indicated is very near in the near future. It says that in verse 20, the steep places shall fall. The word for steep places is towers. Think of the towers around the world. Multi-storey buildings will fall. The loss of life that could occur from an earthquake of that dimensions in this place, at this point where the tectonic plates meet, is horrific. We don't want you to be on the wrong side of the fence when that occurs, friends. Please, don't be there. So this army is defeated by God. What for? Well, there's a particular reason given at the end of the chapter. Now, because we haven't had time to study the whole of Ezekiel, this comes perhaps a little out of the blue, and you don't see that this is very much connected to the whole of Ezekiel. The whole of Ezekiel goes through and talks about God's interactions in man's affairs. What for? In end of verse 23, that they may know that I am Yahweh. That they will know who I am, what I can do, and what I stand for. Now, that comes up quite a few times in the book of Ezekiel if you want to study it. Man has forgotten about God. Man no longer believes that God will intervene and react in world affairs, but he will. He will, when these nations are gathered against his people Israel, God will interact with mankind's affairs in a dramatic and world-changing way so that all the world will know who he is. There are some other events here, and I've gone way beyond my time, I think, if I'm to go through them in detail. So you'll pardon me if I'm to skip through some of the surrounding events fairly quickly, and I'd love to talk to you about these afterwards. The events surrounding this are outlined in other places in the Bible, but we've been talking tonight about which nations align themselves together and their ideology of coming up against Israel. But what else is going to happen around those times? Well, Acts says that Jesus Christ will return visibly and physically to the earth, that Jesus will descend from heaven, and that the dead in Christ, a term describing those that have been believers of Christ and committed to him, will be raised first, and then the living will be brought across to meet Christ and those resurrected in a community. It's a little bit of a summary, but if you have a look at that passage, you'll see what I'm referring to. There'll be a gathering together of Christ's people, and the Song of Moses indicates that the immortal saints will move out from Sinai. It indicates that the place of judgment, the place where Christ will sift his believers from those who haven't obeyed him, will occur at that place of Sinai. At the judgment, Christ will divide between the accepted and the rejected, and the accepted will be made immortal, while the rejected will be sent back into the world to die. All nations will then be gathered to the valley outside of Jerusalem for the battle of Armageddon. And that's the battle that Ezekiel 38 is telling us about, when this great confederacy is gathered into that particular land, and they initially fight against the people of Israel. But once that has occurred, Christ and the saints come as God's response. And Christ and the saints shall fight against all the Jews' enemies once Christ has arrived at the Mount of Olives, and the Mount of Olives will split in the very great earthquake. You'll see, I hope, that I've got quotes with each of these, and I encourage you to come and ask me afterwards if you want a copy of those. And each of those is a small study in its own right, but worth looking at. Elijah will be sent out to the Jews throughout Europe and the rest of the world, and bring Israel back with, at times, terrible fighting to bring them out. And Christ and the saints will rule over the world for 1,000 years, until eventually there is another resurrection, another judgment, and finally there will be no more mortals. The kingdom will then be given back to God to rule, and God will be all in all. That's a flying visit. That's something that requires quite a bit more study, but I hope that what we've done tonight is to give you an overview. And you can see that the events that are going on in this world are well in hand by God. God has a plan. He will work it out. Whether I'm in it or not, he will make his plan happen. He knows what nations will do, and he's steering them toward it. As we said right at the start of tonight, there is a mould, and that mould is set, and the nations are only just being poured into it by God's determination. And God's revealed that to his servants. Our appeal to you, friends, is take note before this happens. This is going to be a grave and serious event which is going to change the world, and we'd really like you to be part of that community who were with Christ at that time and be saved out of it. I hope you found that useful. I know I've covered an enormous amount of material because sometimes we get that opportunity based on a lecture title, and I'd love to talk to you afterwards if we can talk some more about the details. Thank you.